All right, so we're recording now. All right, hi everyone. Today for our first guest on the podcast, we have Matt Rosen, who's a graduate student in computational neuroscience, working in the Friedman Lab, where I also work, and he specifically focuses a lot on working memory, and in particular, kind of short-term synaptic plasticity and kind of activity-silent mechanisms for working memory. So you had a review come up, I guess, last week or not last week, sorry, last year or maybe
Correct.
on reevaluating the role of persistent activity in working memory. And could you start off by just telling us briefly, I guess, what working memory is?
Totally, yeah. So this is actually, I'm glad that you started with this question. So this is something we heard about in the reviews for that particular manuscript when we submitted it, and it turns out to actually be quite a thorny question. So in the past maybe 50, 60 years, since like the 1960s, when people started talking and thinking seriously about working memory as an academic topic, sort of a wealth of definitions have abounded. And unfortunately, they don't all refer to the same thing. So it makes sense to start out with nailing down exactly what we're talking about. So specifically, we think of working memory as the process by which we maintain and manipulate information that we hold in mind. So say I'm, asking you, Reza or Chris, think of what you had for lunch, envision it. That's sort of one process of working memory where you're calling to mind something that you are no longer, sort of physically perceiving. It's not something that you're seeing at the moment. It's something that you had seen before, and yet still you have some representation of it that you can play around with. Sort of, you could rotate it in your head if I asked you to, right? So say you had a burger, or maybe something less symmetrical, something like a slice of pizza. You could, if I said, look at that from all sides in your head, you would be able to do that with ease. So the process of maintaining that piece of information in mind is part of the working memory, but there's also the sort of working component, which is generally also referring to things like, sort of mental rotations or operations on the information that you're holding in there.
So it's kind of information in your, say, mental sketchpad that you can actively manipulate.
Exactly.
And it's kind of ready for manipulation.
Exactly. And people have thought of I think the thing that you've just pointed out sort of highlights a nice breakdown of the way in which people have started to, not really started recently, but started a while ago to think about working memory is sort of made up of multiple components. There's some maybe executive process, which is responsible for, pulling pieces of information or loading pieces of information into sort of active memory, and also for manipulating it in different ways. And the component for keeping information around is maybe not the same as the component that sort of controls what gets loaded in and what gets pulled out and how things are shuffled around between the sort of set of processes that fall under working memory specifically, and then all the things that you might want to do with that information that you're remembering.
Would you say that random access memory, like RAM, and digital computers work as a good analog to working memory?
That's a good question. And actually, this is a debate that I want to be more familiar with. But this is something that you can find reviews that are explicitly addressing this type of question. And I think to some level, the answer is probably yes. Like there's some good analogies that you can draw, but I think that the question, as with any comparison with biological systems, it's always a matter of extent. So to some extent, yes. To some extent, no. And then the important part that people who know more about it than I do, the place where they come in is understanding where that boundary is, sort of where the analogy falls apart.
I guess where that analogy is interesting is if there exists the same sort of distinction between random access memory and hard disk memory in digital computers as it does in the biological brain.
Yeah. And
if you know of a similar distinction.
Yeah, I think maybe taking a step back, a tiny step back. Distinctions that people definitely have drawn historically between things like short-term memory and things like long-term memory. Long-term memory is probably more similar to the type of memory that's like on hard disk, right? And things that you're sort of actively playing with are maybe closer to, and maybe will need in the near term are closer to type of things that you would see in random access memory. Um, there are some places where it's hard to say that distinction actually holds true. In terms of physiological mechanisms, sort of there's a lot of interplay between the same processes that are relevant for the short-term side of memory are also relevant for the long-term side. And as a result, it's not totally clear how distinct those processes are. So maybe it's more of a continuum as opposed to sort of like short-term processes, long-term processes. There's also this idea that short-term and long-term memory are sort of constantly interacting. And the way that you use things in short-term memory also affects how they're represented in long-term memory, potentially. I think one of the things that's made this really hard to study is that more and more it's seeming like this is sort of like a distributed system phenomenon where in order to fully appreciate how short-term memory leads to long-term memory for any particular item. So say you hold something in mind, that piece of information about what you had for lunch, or maybe someone's phone number, right? At some point, maybe you rehearse that information or something like that, and it ends up being encoded in long-term memory. So you can actually sort of flexibly at any point in the future recall what that phone number was. That process for going from the short-term encoding to the long-term encoding, they are related. Very hard to understand what exactly the nature of the relationship is. And so I think that's probably one of the big open questions that remains, at least on the neuroscience side, is understanding sort of or linking the processes that for simplicity have been studied largely separately. But in reality, I'm sure that most people would agree that there's a strong relationship between.
Interesting.
Yeah. I think one of the other things that's made it quite hard is that there's not really, and this is something that Reza and I have touched on before, there's not really as hard of a distinction between sort of like circuits in the brain where memories are stored and circuits in the brain that are responsible for processing information, either sensory information or information that's being recalled from memory somewhere else, right? So the same circuits in many cases that are responsible for sort of like ongoing processing of things that you're perceiving or are playing some role in cognitive processes that are informed by sensory inputs are also probably responsible for storing information over long periods. And so that distinction, I think, is another aspect that has made both the analogy between memory in the brain and memory that computers use, as well as the process for understanding how they're how short-term and long-term memories are kind of implemented in the brain. It's made that very hard to tackle.
Chris, for my sake, can you briefly go over kind of the distinction between random access memory and hard drive memory?
Yeah, I guess what I was trying to get out of that analogy is that there's a difference in the functional characteristics of both. So in random access memory, it's a lot quicker to work with, to write and to read from. And yeah, so speed is, I think, the main difference in function of RAM and hard disk memory. I think just in the way that digital computers are implemented, like physically, hard disk memory just tends to be a lot larger than RAM as well. So I was wondering if the actual neural mechanisms also there are sort of different neural mechanisms that have different functional characteristics. Like say if some neurons are a lot faster to read and write from, but they also require active energy to store something. Because I think RAM requires active energy to store things as well, whereas hard disks they can store memory without any sort of like running energy cost.
Yeah, so that I guess feels kind of similar to the way in which sort of like people have historically thought about mechanisms for short-term storage and for long-term storage. So short-term storage, especially for a process like working memory, people have thought of as basically requiring sort of like continuous neural activity that is related to the thing that's being remembered or the thing that's being held in mind. Whereas long-term memory, the primary substrate that people have sort of focused on is changes to the sort of effective strengths of synaptic connections between pairs of neurons. So in some sense, that relates quite nicely and cleanly to the type of, I guess you didn't explicitly invoke a hierarchy of memory, but there kind of is a hierarchy of memory in digital computers, right? Like you have registers, and then you have main memory, and then you have the sort of hard disk, and there's some levels in between, but roughly like that, where it goes from small size, high speed at the top of the hierarchy to increasingly larger capacity, decreasing speed of access and write as you descend. So there's something analogous to that, right?
Yeah, it's really interesting that you talked about registers as well, because how you were saying that the mechanisms to both store and manipulate information in working memory are the same in the biological brain, whereas it's very much separated in computers. Like you read from RAM first into registers, and then you manipulate the information within the computer registers. Whereas I guess the difference in the brain is that it all gets done in the same place.
Right.
Or at least more so, like you were saying.
Right. And I think that's one of the other things. It's this biological system where things happen massively in parallel, right? And in the digital compute sense, it totally makes sense. Conceptually, it's much simpler. You store something where the representation of that information is not going to be corrupted by other stuff that's going on. That feels like a problem that is somehow addressed in the brain. We don't totally get. Right? Like, how are you storing things on an architecture that's also constantly doing other stuff and also constantly being changed by those other things that it's doing? I have no idea, right? Probably it's involving some other physical substrates aside from just this sort of like one, either neural activity on the short-term side or synaptic connections on the long-term side. Yeah, it makes sense totally that you would separate sort of circuits that are responsible for remembering, or physical substrates that are responsible for remembering stuff, from physical substrates that are responsible for processing information, whether it's remembered information or sort of immediately perceived information. In the brain, that can't be the case. And so there is some mechanism, largely unknown, where the brain can simultaneously sort of remember lots and lots of things with relatively high fidelity, while also being able to immediately respond to lots of novel inputs and also execute operations on the things that it does remember. Yeah, I think the other aspect of that is that our viewpoint of how sort of information is stored historically has been determined. I think as this type of thing is in many cases, the viewpoint is determined by the measurement that can be collected. And historically, on the electrophysiology side, people have, because we've been able to record spikes, these are sort of like, the way in which neurons communicate one another is via action potentials. So these electrical impulses with a particular shape, and if you stick an electrode near a neuron while it's working, you can actually pick up these action potentials, these spikes in the electrical potential, and that's been something that we've been able to do really for quite a long time. So to some extent, in animals that are executing a behavior, our picture is shaped by the thing that we can measure, and that's, for example, largely been spikes, right? In terms of changing synaptic connections as being a primary substrate for long-term memory, that's something that people have been able to investigate, not so much in the context of the way that maybe folks on the artificial intelligence side would think about long-term memory, or in psychology would think about long-term memory, or I guess in cognitive science writ large would think about long-term memory, but more in the context of sort of like learned reflexes. So these reflexive behaviors in very simple organisms it basically became apparent that there was some change in the efficacy of particular synaptic strengths between neurons at the periphery, that receive some sensory stimulus, which is kind of aversive. Usually, this is a tail shock in a type of sea slug, and the eventual sort of behavior that the animal learned to execute whenever it received this activity at the periphery, it would really rapidly execute this evasive behavior.
So the sea slug experiment, is this one of the first experiments kind of investigating longer term memory, or why did you particularly bring up the sea slug experiment? Was it just something?
Yeah. So this is it's one of the sort of like the earliest pieces of the story that suggested that the long-term potentiation of synaptic connections could be the substrate for a long-term memory. So the idea was that people had understood clearly organisms do execute a long-term memory, right? We can remember things over long periods of time. There's almost no question about this. We do it all the time. Experimentally, very tough to get a handle on, but it had become clear that in order to do that type of thing, to say remember something that happened when you were a child maybe years ago, there needs to be some physical change in the architecture of your brain that can last over that type of time period, right? So that's probably a structural change, people had thought. The idea about capacity, right? Like you can remember many, many things, also suggested that this substrate there had to be many opportunities to independently sort of evoke these really long lasting changes that could potentially carry not just one memory, but also many memories. So that made, because people had known that neurons have there are many neurons, and neurons also form many connections, that made the idea of sort of pairwise connections between neurons a very attractive candidate as sort of like the location of long-term change that can outlast, say, seconds to minutes to even hours. So the place in which the sea slug type experiments come in is that people needed, in order to get sort of like a molecular level understanding of, is this really happening? That first, for example, that the strength of synaptic connections is sort of like a substrate for memory. Do they change over long periods of time? Can they sort of remain stable over long periods of time after some change is induced? And then what are the molecular events that underpin that process or underlie that process, right? So in order to study that seriously, that led to this set of experiments in the sea slug. And that kind of opened the door. They basically showed that there were these long-lasting changes in synaptic connectivity that corresponded in a really profound way with the ability of the animal to sort of carry this memory over long periods of time. And then it basically established this as kind of like a model system for investigating and perturbing each of the molecular components to start to get a really nice mechanistic story for, given that synaptic connections change in strength during long-term memory, how is it that they do so? And sort of that was, I think, 60s and 70s was the start of that work. And it's sort of ballooned into this field of long-term potentiation and long-term depression research. We've expanded past the sea slug model, but there's still, I think, really valuable things to learn from that sort of simple reflexive behavior, which I think they're actually analogs in the way that people have come up with very simple tasks to study something like short-term memory before as well.
Do you know how they measure the, say, synaptic strengths in that sea slug?
I don't remember in that set of experiments off the top of my head, but in most cases, the way that they do this type of thing is basically they record from, I think from I guess the gold standard is recordings from presynaptic cell and postsynaptic cells that they know to be connected. And then every time they inject a stimulus into the presynaptic cell, so some amount of activity, they say depolarize that cell by a certain amount, or they inject a certain amount of current. They see how much of a response is elicited in the postsynaptic cell. And then if you keep that recording set up for long enough, then in principle, you could say deliver a bunch of stimuli to the presynaptic cell, see what the level of response is at baseline in the postsynaptic cell, And then you have some protocol maybe for, say, delivering a bunch of stimulation to try and potentiate the strength of the synapse or depress the strength of the synapse. And then sometime later, do the same thing where you apply that sort of brief pulse of current and see what the amount of response is in the postsynaptic cell. So it's kind of like a functional assay of how strong the synapse is. That's actually I think a big remaining question is, are there ways in which we can measure the strength of a synapse in animals that are awake and behaving? I think a lot of this work may have been done in slice, so ex vivo. But that would be a great thing to be able to do in vivo, to start to correlate synaptic strengths, as they change when an animal behaves, with what the animal's behavior actually is. So there's this, if we really think that synaptic strengths are like the substrate of long-term memory, that's a very reductive view. But if we think that they're playing a really important role in long-term memory, then it should be the case that at some point we can record or measure synaptic strengths as they change through time, especially in sort of like a population of cells. That would be really the gold standard evidence for showing that that's playing a really important role in the story.
Yeah, so I guess we started off talking about kind of active working memory. Kind of, we think of it as kind of maintained by some sort of persistent activity, or kind of the current activity of your population.
Right.
And then we kind of pivoted, talked a bit about, I guess, how you can store longer term memories in the structural form, and kind of how that compares to, say, random access versus hard drive. And so actually your recent review was kind of talking about something sort of in the middle. Is that fair to say? Kind of
Yeah, I think it is fair to say.
Mechanisms for working memory.
Totally.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is kind of a controversial topic, but so the historical picture, I guess the dogma, if you will, since probably the 1970s had been that when animals are executing memory over short time periods, say on the order of seconds, and I'm trying to be careful with my nomenclature here, and you'll see why in a minute. So when they're briefly holding information in mind on the order of up to tens of seconds, people had found these were experiments that were done in non-human primates. So basically, people implanted electrodes and collected recordings from different areas of the brain while the animals were trained to sort of keep some piece of information in mind. In this case, it was information about, they were presented with a couple of different slots. One of them had food in it, and then the slots were covered. And then after some time period, the animals were allowed to reach forward toward the slot that they thought the food was at. It turns out animals are really great at this. Food is highly motivating. While animals were doing this, people basically identified neurons in part of the prefrontal cortex, which would start firing action potential, so start being active and spiking when the animal saw that there was a piece of fruit behind a particular one of the slots. And they would continue firing at an elevated level for the duration of the delay period, they would call it. So the period of time where the animal could no longer see the fruit, but before it was able to reach for the fruit. And so this led to the hypothesis that when you're holding something in mind over short time periods, the neural correlate of that phenomenon is there's some subset of cells that are persistently encoding that item that you just seen, or whatever piece of information you're keeping at the front of your mind. And so there was that was in the early 1970s. There was a kind of two groups that had started doing this, and they both found roughly the same thing. And this extended through work done in the 1980s, where people said, all right, let's be a little more rigorous about this, and let's do this sort of a more well-controlled task, right? So it's, there are lots of things that happen upstream in terms of like what the sensory stimulus is in the experiment where the animal is just kind of reaching for a fruit, right? So a group at Yale, this was the group of Patricia Goldman-Rakich. They started doing this set of tasks. I think other groups did similar stuff around the same time as well, but they called these oculomotor delayed response tasks. So the idea was basically, okay, the early experiments had started with the simplest possible thing that we can do to get the animal to execute a behavior that requires that it, maintain some piece of information in mind, right? So the idea is, we can't, because we can't communicate with these animals with language, we need them to indicate through their behavior that they did or did not remember something. What's the simplest way that we can do that? And the model that people came up with, it's similar to that initial one from the early 70s, but more well-controlled is this delayed response type paradigm. So basically it goes as follows. You show the animal some piece of information very briefly, and then you remove it. And then after a couple seconds, you require that the animal generate some behavioral response that indicates that it actually did remember what it had seen a couple seconds ago. And the way that people had started doing this was with by showing animals sort of dots on a screen, so these spatial locations or targets, and then requiring that after this delay period where there's nothing on the screen, that they make an eye movement, a rapid saccadic eye movement to that location on the screen. And if the animal remembered sort of where the dot had been, then they would be able to execute that eye movement with a high level of accuracy, and they'd be able to do so quickly, right? So they trained animals to do this, and they also found neurons in the prefrontal cortex, and later started finding neurons elsewhere in the cortex, usually in sensory motor or executive regions. Examples of these neurons that are sort of persistently active through the delay period when there's nothing on the screen. So this period while the animal is maintaining something but not perceiving something, and persistently active in particular in a way that seemed to be specific to some kinds of sample stimulus and not others. So in the case of motion, or in the case of sort of like saccade directions, for example, or saccade locations, they often found neurons that when, say, the location was at the top center of the screen, this neuron would fire really strongly during the delay period when the location was no longer there and the animal was keeping it in mind. And for basically all other locations, wouldn't fire much at all during the delay period. So,
sorry, Matt, could I just ask
totally.
you to clarify what is a saccade location?
Yeah, so saccade location. So saccade is just a rapid eye movement. This is the way that basically most primates move their eyes. I think all primates. So your eyes dart around the screen. This is the same thing that would let, say, a proctor who's looking at you on Zoom determine whether you're paying attention to the class or whether you're reading something else on the screen, right? So your eyes are, left to right, that kind of thing. The saccade location in the context of that task is basically just the place on the screen where the animal needed to move its eyes to.
Right.
So if the animal makes the eye movement to the place where that dot had been shown, then it's a readout that they did in fact remember where it was shown. And so basically there's a lot of, really quite a lot of evidence that during this type of task, at least, that the main correlate of holding information in mind seemed to be neurons that were persistently active, and in particular, persistently active and specific to the thing that was being held in mind during that delay period, right? But there are a few things that are probably relevant in terms of experimental design that maybe complicate this picture a little bit. So the task that I've just mentioned, as soon as the animal sees the dot on the screen, it is able to determine what it's going to need to do in order to indicate that it remembered the thing and also to get reward, right? So as soon as it sees where the dot is, all it has to do is say, all right, I'm going to plan on making a movement there, right? And that's maybe the thing that it has to maintain during the delay period. So it's not clear whether it's maintaining this is very imprecise wording, a representation of the stimulus per se during the delay period, or whether it's maintaining an intended motor plan, which is basically, I'm going to keep activity and rolling in this part of the PFC, which is saying, all right, I'm intending to move my eyes to the left as soon as the delay period ends. And those are related, but I think distinct possibilities. So people came up with designs to try to address this, right? Where they would show, you need some way of basically making it such that the animal can't plan its movement until after the delay period. And that way, when you're looking at activity during the delay, you'll be able to say this is related to the maintenance of the information per se, and not just an intention to move. So people came up with these before we've been talking about these delayed response paradigms. A subset of this is now these delayed matching paradigms, where basically what you do is you present a sample stimulus, that stimulus before the delay period, the same way that you would before. And then after the delay, you present another one. And then the animal has to indicate whether they matched or not. There are different rules that you could use for this matching. So it could be, say, were the stimuli exactly the same, or did they belong to some category in common or not? But that way, the animal doesn't know what it's going to have to indicate until after the delay period, when it sees that test stimulus. And using this type of task, and I think variants of this type of task, people started to see that there were some examples where, even though animals, even in cases where animals were behaviorally performing the task to a high level of accuracy, so indicating with really basically every trial getting correct whether the stimuli did or did not match that were shown, there were often cases where the proliferation of neurons that were sort of like persistently active and encoding that what the sample stimulus had been during the delay period, even in the same areas that people had recorded from before, was not as high as people had observed in the previous delayed response type paradigm. So there are cases, for example, of say in the prefrontal cortex, not prefrontal cortex, in the parietal cortex. So this is a related sensory motor region where people had also observed neurons, like I'd mentioned before, which are sort of like strongly encoding the thing that's being held in mind during the delay. In delayed matching tasks that use motion stimuli, so it's sets of dots that are moving they're all moving in some direction, and then the animal has to indicate whether the first set of dots and the second set of dots are moving in the same direction. In a task like that, in the parietal cortex, you see basically no persistent encoding of the that initial stimulus during the delay. So no persistent activity, even though the animal very clearly remembers what the stimulus is, because it gets the task right almost every time.
So can I briefly summarize the story so far?
Yeah. It's zigzagged in a bunch of ways. So that'll probably be
that was an interesting story, actually. I like that you started all the way at the beginning with sea slugs. And then, okay, so I guess at first we had we're starting out with sea slugs, but kind of with the food reaching task, where you kind of occlude, say you have slots and you kind of put food and you hide the slots and the animal has to remember.
Yep.
And so that was kind of the first, say, class of working memory task. But what people realized there was that there's kind of still, or it's hard to control for, say, the active stimulus in front of the animal versus the kind of memory part of it, which is, some notion of some representation of a previous stimulus or something like that.
Right.
And then, so from there, we go to oculomotor task, where there's some screen and say there's some dots moving in some motion, and then there's a blank screen. And so you're kind of, say, cutting off the stimulus and saying that if indeed there's some neuron that was persistently coding for some stimulus direction during the delay period, that stimulus was no longer present, and so it must have been representative of the first kind of sample period. Right. But then what people realized then was that you still have this kind of that there's a difference between, say, like you said, the representation per se versus the motor plan.
Right. And
so we move from that to the delayed matching, or kind of delayed, I guess, decision paradigm, where you have a stimulus and then you have a delay, and then you have a second stimulus or a second prompt from which you can't really have a plan from the onset. You have to kind of hold this thing, and then depending on that second thing, make a decision.
Right.
And where things start to get interesting is that you're saying that in this kind of third paradigm, you notice that sometimes there was not clear kind of activity encoding, during the delay. And I suppose another thing to clarify was that were most of these decodings kind of single cell or were they population?
These are all single cell.
Okay.
So the ability to record from populations of neurons in the non-human primate system is something of a new innovation. So maybe last 10-ish years, people have started to have good success with that. So historically, pretty much single electrode recordings.
Okay, so where we are in this story of our understanding of working memory, from what I understand, is that now we've come to the bit where we realize there might be something else going on other than persistent firing,
right? And
which explains the capabilities of working memory.
Potentially, yeah. And I think the thing to emphasize is that it's quite clear that activity during the delay period is extremely important for working memory. The points I think to emphasize are maybe twofold. One of them is that sort of like this accumulation of evidence has suggested that the level of persistent activity and what it seems to be doing is much more variable than one might have expected. Given that animals are performing all of these tasks at a high level of accuracy, if it really is the case that persistent activity is sort of like the substrate of information, then in cases where the animal gets it right, you should expect basically not to see much of a drop in persistent activity. And in fact, the level of persistent activity that's observed, as well as the information content of that activity, seems to be much more variable than people would have expected. So that's one aspect. Persistent activity from the type of experiment that we've managed to do seems to be quite variable. I think the second aspect is that it's actually really difficult to interpret what it is that persistent activity is good for, even if you are able to encode a piece of information from it, say that's being held in mind. So to make that more concrete, I would suggest the distinction between encoding a piece of information per se. So say you have some amount of persistent activity that encodes a sample stimulus, whatever it is. So it's you can look at that activity and you can say, I know what the animal is holding in mind, right? It's not clear whether that activity is related to actually maintaining that information or whether it's a control signal, which is sort of accessing that information from elsewhere or broadcasting that information to somewhere else, which is actually going to be the site of storage. So there's this issue with not only that persistent activity itself, its level, and when it appears seems to vary more than people had expected, but also interpreting what that might mean for sort of the execution of working memory is also not a straightforward thing to interpret.
So there's potentially, I suppose, two new developments or recent developments in the story of working memory. So one of them is, I guess, perhaps moving from a single cell picture to a population picture, or kind of the idea of a state space perspective.
Yes.
And so is that state space perspective or population perspective enough to account for, say, the lack of persistent decoding from a single cell level? Or do you really think there's kind of more than just, say, activity on a population level?
It's hard to know. I suspect that it won't tell us the whole story, I think. And I think that relates to maybe the second point that you're getting to, which is the whole sort of story that we've been discussing has focused on the role of persistent neural activity that encodes something that's being held in mind briefly. There's also the possibility that there are other physical substrates that are relevant for maintaining that information. So the presentation of some piece of information drives changes to neural activity, that's a given, but also drives changes to other substrates within the brain. So they're not just neurons, but they're also synaptic connections between neurons, and those are kind of like related to neurons, but they're not the same as neural activity. So that's I think the other direction which we're now starting to explore. This is basically all theoretical work at this point, but this idea that maybe neural activity is not going to tell the whole story of what changes are being driven in the brain during the process of maintaining some piece of information in mind that last long enough to actually keep that information around.
So we talked, I guess, about persistent activity or kind of neural activity as encoding working memory, and then we talked about kind of longer term synaptic plasticity. And one of the perspectives you put forward in your review was kind of this intermediate or short term synaptic plasticity. Can you kind of tell us how that differs from both? Well, you've already told us a bit how it differs from the kind of active persistent activity picture. How does that differ from the, say, long term synaptic plasticity picture?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think, as with most of the stories that we discussed, this is a story that actually begins in the 1960s, maybe even the 1950s. But
fruitful decade for neuroscience, or
yeah, it was really an incredible time. But there was this hypothesis that so people had started to. There were lots of elements of the process of synaptic transmission that were not yet clear. So when I'm referring to synaptic transmission, I'm referring to the sort of the broad mechanism through which neurons that are connected through synapses communicate with one another. So I guess a very brief bit of background. We had talked before about neurons communicating using action potentials. So these spikes in the membrane voltage. So membrane voltage typically sits at like negative 70 millivolts, and then they spike up a bunch and then drop back down. And that spike in membrane potential is called an action potential. That doesn't actually tell you how that electrical impulse is communicated between two neurons that are not themselves like very directly touching. So when neurons are connected at a synapse, there's actually some space between them called the synaptic cleft. And in many neurons, the process of transmitting that information, which is carried through that spike in membrane potential, happens through the transmission of chemical packets of information. So this spike in membrane potential travels to what's called the presynaptic terminal. So this is the part of the neuron 1 of the equation that's going to send that information to neuron 2. That spike of membrane potential causes calcium to enter the cell and packets of neurotransmitter to leave the cell. Those packets of neurotransmitter diffuse across the synaptic cleft, so this small little space between the presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron, and bind to receptors there and drive depolarization of the postsynaptic cell's membrane at that local patch of tissue. So in summary, synaptic transmission involves action potential entering presynaptic terminal that causes calcium channels to open, and calcium enters the presynaptic terminal. One of the actions of calcium is to initiate the release of packets of these neurotransmitters, which bind to the postsynaptic cell and drive depolarization there. And really central to that process is calcium. So every time the presynaptic cell spikes, right, some amount of calcium enters the presynaptic cell and it causes stuff to leave. And so in the 1960s, people began to think about what happens when, say, after one of those action potentials has happened. Is it really the case that all of the calcium that enters the cell as a result of that process immediately drives neurotransmitter release and then is just not usable anymore? Or is maybe there's some trace of calcium that remains, say, after the spike enters and sticks around for some period of time? And this came out of some work which had basically found that, using the type of setup that we talked about before with how do you measure functionally the strength of a synaptic connection, you record from the pre and the post, and or maybe just even the post, and you see if the level of response of that cell changes if you keep the amount of stimulation of the presynaptic cell constant, right? So input is constant, output, is it changing? If it is changing, then the strength of the synapse is changing, at least is the logic. So people had observed actually that if you were to do this type of experiment, even over very short timescales, say tens to hundreds of milliseconds, you would find that the effective strength of synaptic connections in many cases seems to change, and change by up to orders of magnitude. So really quite profoundly. And so there is this rush to try and understand what the mechanism that drives that observed change in synaptic efficacy might be. And so one of the hypotheses was this thing with residual calcium, where how is it that, so say there are cases where the connection is facilitated between the pre and the postsynaptic cell. So some amount of firing in the presynaptic neuron causes, X amount of response in the postsynaptic cell. And then if you try to send information through that channel again sufficiently soon afterwards, to say 10 or 100 milliseconds after, the response in the postsynaptic cell is 2x what it was before. So in cases like that, what might cause the potentiation of a connection over such a short time scale, right? And so people have thought, okay, we understand roughly in broad strokes what the aspects of synaptic transmission are. Maybe, there's this influx of calcium into the presynaptic cell as a result of that previous spike. If some of that calcium were to stick around, then maybe the next time a spike comes, there's more calcium that can cause neurotransmitter to be released. And maybe that'll just drive a larger response in the postsynaptic cell. So, people had started to think about these type of things, and they found some evidence that this actually seems to be the case. If you measure the concentration of calcium in the presynaptic terminal, you find actually that it seems to be elevated by a little bit after some amount of presynaptic spiking has happened, and that decays quite rapidly. So through experiments like this, and actually lots of other kinds of experiments, people have started to flesh out this story that there actually seems to be a really robust feature of how neurons communicate with one another seems to actually involve short-term changes to the efficacy of those connections that drive the communication. No, go for it.
How do you differentiate between, say, increased synaptic efficacy versus, say, increased cell excitability? So kind of the difference between each cell being more likely to then fire after either the presynaptic or postsynaptic cell versus the connection between those two cells, kind of meaningfully strengthening or something.
Yeah, I think the way in which I'm not super familiar with this aspect of literature, but I suspect that the way in which people have done this, at least from the limited amount that I remember, is probably doing this type of stimulation protocol and seeing if the change happens at synaptic connections that are distant from one another. So if you record the response of the postsynaptic cell, say it's synapse 1, which is at, say on the left branch of this tree of dendrites where the neurons receive their inputs, and you record from a different part on that cell. And in the one case, you're actually, say that the first connection that you're looking at, you're delivering a protocol where you're expecting that synapse to be facilitated a little bit, but you're also simultaneously looking at activity at the other synapse. If it is the case that it's a cell-specific and not a synapse-specific phenomenon, then you should see some potentiation of the postsynaptic response, even at the synapse that it, wasn't actually stimulated and you don't expect to be facilitated.
Right. You take kind of another dendritic branch or something, and then see.
Exactly.
So,
I think the other aspect of this is that one of the features of synaptic contacts on the postsynaptic cell. So one of the features of cells that are receiving connections from other cells is, or the area of the cell where neurons are receiving connections from other cells, is that in many cases they're happening. So that whole part of the cell is called the dendritic tree. The site of each individual synaptic contact, in many cases, happens at these small little protuberances that are called dendritic spines. And for the most part, these are biochemically sort of like distinct zones where what happens in the dendritic spine kind of stays in the dendritic spine from a signaling perspective. The upshot of that is that because all of the sites of the connections are sort of chemically separated from one another or biochemically separated from one another, because the events that are happening are thought to involve that type of signaling process, either the accumulation of some type of molecule presynaptically or postsynaptically, or the increased activation of a particular type of receptor on the postsynaptic cell, that all is basically restricted just to that synaptic site. There's some evidence that there's sort of like diffusion that allows signaling between dendrites that are near to one another, but probably not enough to initiate a sort of cell-wide excitability change. But I guess so that's kind of the molecular side of things, sort of ramblings about what the evidence has been and hypotheses about the mechanism for the idea that individual synaptic strengths change as a result of activity of the presynaptic cell, and also the observation that these changes actually, to the functional efficacy of those connections, seem to last for hundreds of milliseconds to maybe even seconds. So that latter attribute in particular made sort of initiated this line of thought in sort of like boutique substrates for memory. That is, substrates for memory that are not neural activity for short-term memory in terms of theoretical investigation. So if it is the case that you're going to have some physical change that lasts long enough to, keep some trace of something that had happened before around, then whatever the use case is, the time constant over which those changes last, or that determines how long those changes last, has to be long enough to match the behavioral need. So in tasks where, say, you're keeping information in mind for only on the time scale of a few seconds, this substrate for information potentially becomes quite relevant. And
so you're saying that changes in the strength of synaptic connections basically help in some way store working memory.
That at least is the theory, that they may help to store information over short time periods. And I think there are sort of maybe three things to make specific about that. The first is that these are temporary changes. So I didn't mention that before, but it seems in the case of long-term memory, it's also sort of like some history activation in the circuit causes long-term changes to the strength of synaptic connections. They're potentially slow to induce, but they last for a really long time. In this case, the changes are rapidly induced, and they die out quite quickly. So this is related to the idea that if it really is the case that the change in synaptic efficacy relates to sort of like an accumulation of calcium, as soon as the calcium is no longer remaining around, then any trace of the facilitation is gone. So changes that are quick to induce, but also quick to die out. So first, they're very temporary changes, which distinguishes them from long-term plasticity, the type that we talked about in the context of long-term memory. The other aspects of the story that I think are probably worth being quite clear about is that it's largely theoretical at this point. So this has been one of those cases where we had talked about the picture that we can consider as delimited by what we can measure. And Reza had mentioned this a little bit before, I guess, or I'd asked a question about this, but recording or measuring synaptic efficacies or synaptic strengths in vivo is effectively impossible at the moment. And it's effectively impossible in particular for large populations of or large cohorts of connections between neurons, right? So, it's very tough. We can start to make predictions about, like, is it the case that this type of process could maintain information? The answer in theory seems to be yes in some settings. But I think we're now at the stage where we're trying to make specific predictions about if it is the case that sort of this substrate is actually relevant for the types of working memory that we're interested in studying, then what type of neural activity would you expect to observe as a result? And how does that differ from the sort of standard model where it's all being maintained in neural activity? And I think one of the problems there is, because we can't directly measure synaptic strengths, we can't directly show or disprove that this hypothesis about an alternate substrate for memory over short time periods actually is true or relevant. But the next steps, I think, probably involve clever experimental design to say, can we generate good predictions about the thing that we can measure, which is neural activity, under the condition of short-term synaptic plasticity being relevant for maintaining information briefly or not being relevant for maintaining information briefly. But it's kind of a bummer. I wish we could actually just record these synaptic efficacies and directly see whether it's true or not. I think the points that we can count on are severalfold. One of them is that it definitely is the case that short-term synaptic plasticity happens, right? We're starting to have a molecular understanding of how this happens. There's some relatively recent work from Wade Regere's lab at Harvard, which sort of identifies the sort of critical molecular elements of the story, where there's this particular type of protein which binds to calcium in the presynaptic terminal, which seems to be actually necessary for facilitation of synapses over short time periods. So with this protein, you do show short-term facilitation. Without it, you don't. So definitely some evidence that it happens. We're starting to understand not just that it happens, but also how it might happen. And I think the remaining part is like, to what end? There are contexts, more sensory contexts, where people have shown that it confers different, very desirable properties on particular types of synaptic connection. Say in the context of audition, right, where you need to I guess the type of signal that you're transducing in many cases is extremely high frequency, right? A very high frequency sound. You have to transduce that information and then represent it through neural activity in some way. There's some evidence that that short-term facilitation and depression are actually relevant in terms of conveying sort of like frequency invariant responses that are important for the processing of that kind of signal that comes from the periphery. But in the context of sort of cognitive questions like working memory, etc., not totally clear.
Okay, to ask like a sort of more high level question, other than, at the moment still not being so sure what exactly are the neural substrates that support working memory, what would you say are the other biggest unanswered questions in our current understanding of not just working memory, but just memory in general?
Great question.
Or we could start with something actually more specific to what we just talked about, which I had in mind, was so the interesting thing is that the way you told that story made it sound almost like this leftover calcium thing is kind of an accident, and it's perhaps a happy accident. But could you conjecture as to why something like short-term synaptic plasticity might be useful as a working memory mechanism? Totally. Because I suppose this is not totally known at all.
There are a couple types of explanation, I think, that that suggest maybe benefits for something like short-term plasticity. One of them is that neural activity is very expensive. So this is like the standard explanation that people have used for why some type of memory that doesn't require neural activity over short time periods might actually be helpful. And
even over the scale of a second or something like that?
Even over the scale of a second. So the brain is somewhat of a gas guzzler in terms of in terms of energy that the body consumes. So it's not that large of a percentage of the body mass in humans, but the amount of energy consumption is something like 5 or 10 times what you'd expect just based on how large it is, right? So it really uses a lot of memory. I mean, sorry, a lot of a lot of energy. It also probably uses a lot of memory, but the a lot of that energy seems to come from maintaining particular gradients of ions that are sort of present at baseline and then disrupted as a result of, or changed as a result of neural activity. So in order to keep things at this baseline state that can support sort of the regular propagation of signals between neurons, these ion pumps have to basically be constantly operating. And as it turns out, that process of pumping ions against their gradients is quite metabolically demanding. So in terms of sort of like detailed quantitative picture of how expensive the neural activity that you might observe during working memory might be, I don't know that we have a great answer to that. But at least the high level logic or intuition has held that if you can get by with less neural activity, that's a good thing. So that's potentially one possibility, right? This short-term synaptic plasticity, if you can actually maintain information through those synaptic states without requiring that there be some persistently active signal through the delay period, or as long as you need to maintain that memory, but rather just by the sort of like the fact that calcium can remain in the presynaptic terminal for a little bit, that would potentially save you a bunch on energy usage. So that's maybe one aspect of the story. Silent memory is maybe cheaper. I think other aspects have to do with the stability of the representation. So, and I don't know in a very rigorous way that this has to be true, but one possibility is that say you're maintaining a piece of information in mind through neural activity. It's possible that that's not as resistant to, say, the presence of distracting stimuli as a solution that involves both neural activity as well as some other sort of architectural change that maybe lasts for some longer time period, that even if your attention is diverted elsewhere and briefly activity encodes something else, can maybe pull you back to activity that encodes the thing that you were remembering before. So
that's interesting you brought that up, because remember I'm not sure if you read this, but the Tim Bushman article where he had the color wheel. So yeah, maybe Chris, you haven't read this article, but there's a study where it's a task where you have a color wheel, and then first the animal, either a monkey or human, was shown a color, and then after a delay period, it was shown a color wheel, and then the human has to rotate the color wheel to kind of select the correct color from before the delay period, and the animal has to make, or the monkey has to make a saccade to the correct color on the wheel. And they found that humans were that kind of, they were selecting colors uniformly from this wheel. And so from total trials, you'll expect that the distribution of responses from the animals will be also uniform. But they found that actually it bunched up, or it had modes at discrete points around the wheel. And so they saw this as evidence for a discrete attractor strategy for working memory. Kind of, you have the good analogy or picture to have here is, say, in a 2D state space, if you had a blanket and then you had kind of, or just kind of like a geographic landscape, and then you had kind of bowls, kind of like in a skate park or something, so that even if you're at the bottom of the bowl, even if you had noise perturbing you, you will kind of stay in that bowl. And that's kind of a discrete attractor picture. And so they hypothesized that this kind of discrete attractor picture is useful to combat noise in precisely that way. But the interesting thing about that is that you're kind of trading off some precision, right, for this kind of robustness to noise, because you're kind of adopting a discrete strategy to an inherently continuous working memory problem.
Yes.
But if you had something like short-term plasticity, and you could kind of have discrete structures on demand, you wouldn't even have to have that trade-off. But it seems like, but it doesn't seem like that's what, or I'm not sure. I have to read the article more, but it seems like their overall, or at least their model was not that. Their model was that it was kind of a fixed state space with fixed discrete attractors. It wasn't this picture of I can have a discrete attractor on demand that could maybe be possible with short-term facilitation.
Right. I think so. The point relating the sort of pitting the two possibilities, the continuous attractor to represent continuous quantity versus discrete attractor to do good enough for the continuous quantity, actually relates in theory quite strongly to the presence of short-term plasticity and sort of what its role might be, to what end. So one of the issues that people have had for a long time with the continuous attractor model of, working memory type processes, so how you're maintaining continuous quantities in mind, is that in order to be stable, they often require an extreme level of fine tuning of synaptic connectivity, right? So one of the things that people see is that if you perturb connectivity even a little bit for one of these systems that's organized like a continuous attractor, then all of a sudden you basically flop all over the place and things totally break apart. One of the other things is that this is kind of like what Reza had mentioned with the presence of noise in the system. It affects the sort of quality of the memory potentially really strongly in a system with continuous attractors. So say you're, say we're not dealing with color, but say we're dealing with like head direction or motion direction or something, right? So this is an attractor, or a set of attractors that are organized in a circle, and the activity of the system forms a bump somewhere along that circle, right? So say it's head direction. When the animal is turning its head to the right, then the bump of activity along that attractor is sort of like at 45 degrees or something, right? But actually, I guess scratch head direction. Say we're just maintaining spatial location on the screen somewhere, right? It's the same idea. So say you show something at 45 degrees, then the animal's maintaining 45 degrees. That corresponds with a bump of activity along this ring attractor. During something like a delay period, it's known that neural systems are quite noisy. And so the presence of noise in the system potentially pushes the bump of activity that encodes the memory on that ring attractor in different directions around the ring. And in systems that are continuous attractor systems, because each point, even points that are not the initial point, are actually quite attractive, then noise can really strongly disrupt the quality of the memory representation. So the longer the time of the memory maintenance goes, the sort of further off your memory becomes, just due to like the effects of accumulating noise. One of the possibilities people have proposed for short-term synaptic plasticity is that it maybe is some mechanism for like locking the location of the bump in place, right? So say that stimulus that is this dot at the top right, like 45 degrees is shown, maybe short-term depression or facilitation that's driven by the presentation of that stimulus causes the points that are sort of next to 45 degrees along that circle to not be as attractive. And so the state of the system can sort of more solidly lock onto the actual location that it needs to maintain. And even little amounts of noise that are sort of present and accumulating during the delay aren't sufficient to jostle that around too far.
Right. So potentially you could kind of learn a more stable kind of continuous attractor like a ring that kind of encode, say, the underlying structure of the problem, and then short-term synaptic plasticity can add, say, a discrete attractor particular to this kind of, say, trial or this kind of context that then gives you some robustness.
Exactly.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So it's like a slightly different version of the same type of possibility that you mentioned before, which is like, well, if you're changing connectivity, maybe that allows you to actually just, driven by the stimulus, synthesize a new discrete attractor somewhere within the state space.
Right. That seems like it should be the case, because then you kind of have a bit of the best of both worlds. Or
Yes,
you don't have to trade off so much precision for robustness.
totally.
But I suppose it's still still an experimental question if that is indeed the case. But that'll be an interesting one too.
Yeah.
I'm interested in the answer to that. So.
Yeah, and people have been talking about that possibility, the possibility of the short-term plasticity mechanisms as some sort of like stability type addition to a continuous attractor system. They've been talking about that for a while, at least since like early mid 2000s. So I don't know exactly what the experiment would be to verify whether that's true. It would probably involve some interesting type of perturbation to try and force activity around the ring. If you are assuming that there is a ring attractor, to force it in different ways and see how that relates to the quality of the memory and also the state of neural activity that you're recording. Hopefully high throughput, but I don't totally know. That's the other thing. In addition to not being able to measure synaptic states, we don't really have ways to specifically perturb them yet. So it makes validating this type of hypothesis quite difficult, I think.
Yeah, maybe we can return to Chris's kind of original question, or the broader question,
right,
of big questions in working memory and memory in general. Did you have anything in mind?
Yeah, so I think, and this is all kind of personal opinion and that kind of stuff. My general impression is that sort of like the systems neuroscience side is focused on understanding sort of like questions of, at the beginning, questions of when and where. So for any given, say it's a sensory problem, right? So for any given sensory stimulus, when is that stimulus driving activity in the brain and where is it driving activity in the brain, right? So, for say touch, you could identify from the touch receptors that are embedded in the skin, hairy and hairless, you could identify the flow of information all the way up to the primary somatosensory cortex, and then track the progression of that information as it sort of spreads throughout the central nervous system, right? And you can do that for all the other sensory systems, and people have done that actually for all of these cases, right? So say, for example, for visual information, people have identified using the lens of when and where, the fact that information about at the retina, you sort of first encounter photons that are conveying visual information. You can track that to the thalamus and then back to the primary visual cortex. And then you actually, can find that information diverges, right? So there's one pathway, sort of distinct anatomical pathway, which confers information about what an object is, so object identity. And then there's a separate pathway which confers information about sort of where an object is in space. So spatial information about things in the visual field, as well as what those things are. And those are...
Is what the ventral?
Or yes,
is that the
what
other
is
way
the
around?
ventral stream and where is the dorsal stream? So here in the lab, we've had this focus on the dorsal stream for a while because we think we understand decently well the early stages of sort of like how information about where objects are and object motion is represented. But I think the next set of questions, and you can apply a similar lens to say like the working memory type question, right? So like you train an animal to perform a task that requires working memory, and then you collect recordings from any of a set of different areas, and you see if it's the case that the signals that you observe are actually related to the information that's being held in mind, right? And then you come up with this picture of like, okay, the prefrontal cortex is relevant for working memory. The parietal cortex in some areas is relevant for working memory. The parts of the hippocampus are relevant for working memory, right? I think the big question that remains is the question of how now, and that how probably encompasses a lot of different elements. There's how in terms of from the system side, how is it that information in these areas is actually relevant for the behavior that's being executed? That story probably entails some communication between them, right? So different areas in isolation seem to be representing information. How is it that through their interaction, they're actually combining that information and using it to drive the behavioral output of the animal? That's a big question, requires recording from and potentially perturbing simultaneously many different brain regions, which is technically obscenely demanding. But because of things like the Brain Initiative in the U.S. and other initiatives throughout the world are becoming more attainable, and you could actually kind of plan experiments to do that type of thing, not just in the mouse, but in rat and in primate as well. So I think on the working memory side, at least, that's what I would view as sort of like big outstanding question, which is sort of like changing the type of question. And this is not to say that people haven't been doing this already. This is very much work that's ongoing, but I just don't know that the answer is fully there yet. I think also big questions that I would love to see answered involve linking that high level systems understanding, what information is being represented, where it's being represented, when it's being represented, and how it's being used, or how it seems to be used in the context of generating behavior. Linking that type of understanding, a systems neuroscience question, I think with the cellular and molecular type of question, is another really important direction for us to understand. So the one of the ultimate goals for understanding this type of stuff, you could have the goal of engineering intelligence, which is definitely a valuable goal, and you could make great headway with that type of insight. In terms of therapies for human disease is another potential output, and in the vast majority of cases, there are lots of types of therapy that one could execute, but pharmacological therapies basically require that you have a detailed, or at least a somewhat detailed, molecular understanding of sort of like what it is that causes the neural correlates of whatever cognitive process or sensory process that you're interested in, what causes that to arise. And then if you understand in healthy individuals how that arises, then you can start to say, okay, we know when it's perturbed that it correlates with this type of activity, and that should relate to this particular type of receptor inactivation or something when it shouldn't be inactivated. So at the end of the day, for therapeutic questions, it requires an answer or an insight and eventually an answer at the level of molecules and receptors and individual cell types. And so I think that's maybe an important thing to do, is to start to link the high level systems understanding, what information is being represented, where and how is it being used, with the sort of cells and molecules. When that process goes wrong, now how can we effectively address it? I think one of the things that makes it or has made it very hard is precisely the problem that has made that first question hard, which is it's distributed across many brain areas. And so, it's just by focusing on one place, you're probably not going to actually make any headway at all. But that's becoming less of a problem technically. And so I'm hopeful that will be a question that we can start to see some satisfying answers for.
Interesting, yeah. And it's interesting that you talked about the different incentives. So not just in engineering better AI, but also in understanding brain diseases to do with working memory as well. So would you say that within the field of neuroscience, that the sort of research that you're doing now is getting more or less attention?
It's a good question. I think probably increasing attention. From both angles, right? So like on the AI side, there are things that working memory seems to be like really core to the ability of organisms like humans to flexibly coordinate behaviors across a variety of environments to suit a variety of behavioral demands. These are things that it would be great if we could train artificial agents to be able to replicate, right? Transfer across environments, transfer of skills, learning new skills. Those are all things that an AI researcher would love to have. So I think from that angle, the understanding how that happens in the brains of organisms that actually already do that has started to receive a bunch of interest. I think on the therapy side as well, the sort of like magnitude of the health problems and the at least economic cost on society that results from issues where working memory is perturbed are as the population size increases and the prevalence of diseases is not all that low, it becomes a huge burden. And so I think from that translational perspective as well, it's, the interest in this type of question and this type of insight, I think, is increasing too.
What's an example of a working memory disease?
Interestingly enough, it seems to be perturbed in lots of disease states. So not all of them actually are even maybe, accurately referred to as disease. So for example, in aging, normal human aging, you find that older individuals tend to show a sort of a diminished capacity for working memory and diminished fidelity of the working memories that are maintained, right? So that's one of the things. Regular aging, as well as things like there's sort of like a spectrum of milder cognitive impairments that accompany aging, but are not quite at the level of like neurodegenerative disease. And then also in things like schizophrenia and Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, where sort of like gross cell death also in many cases, perhaps unsurprisingly, corresponds with an inability to execute core cognitive functions like working memory. So seems to be perturbed in many cases. Whether the reason for the perturbation or the pathology of the perturbation is the same, almost certainly not. So there are different ways to mess up working memory. Definitely true. And even if you were to just be able to address it in aging population, I think that would be an incredible thing to do, right? Like as life expectancy increases around the world, more and more individuals are starting to live to older ages, and then the cognitive impairments that accompany normal aging become a much larger problem. So even just in that case, for that one type of setting where working memory ability is impacted, would be a great thing to be able to address. There's some really interesting work starting to get at this question. There was a very cool paper in Nature Neuroscience in 2019 about using some type of non-invasive stimulation. I think it was transcranial direct current stimulation, to applying it to older individuals and showing that there is a benefit for working memory that lasts for, I think, on the order of days. So a brief session of applying this type of stimulation seems to change the way in which different brain areas are interacting. And it does so in a way that outlasts the application of that type of stimulation, and seems not to be accompanied by other types of deficit, and rather actually sort of a specific enhancement of these individuals' ability to keep information in mind. And I don't know what the end result of that line of research is going to be, but it suggests at least an interesting avenue where maybe there are things that we can do even without a very detailed understanding of sort of like cell by cell, how is working memory being implemented, just by doing these sort of gross extracranial stimulation things that that can lead to a really marked improvement in cognitive ability.
Yeah, that's crazy. I didn't know that we're already at that stage where you can sort of just zap the brain in a certain way.
Yeah, I'm sure that there's there are technical aspects that are lost on me a little bit, and I've definitely left out. But I'd be happy to send you guys the link later, by the way, if you want.
Oh, great.
Yeah. I mean, Reza, if you don't have any other questions about this specific topic on working memory, I thought this latest thing that we're talking about is quite a nice segue to ask Matt about what he thinks about the Neuralink, like the recent achievements by Neuralink with the monkey MindPong stuff is.
I think it's very impressive. Have you? I assume you guys have seen the video, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's very impressive.
Yeah.
So I'm not a full disclosure. I'm not an expert in the brain computer interface side of things, but yeah, even in traditional, I guess maybe especially in traditional academic settings, you don't even really we haven't seen stuff like that to date.
I think yeah, I was really impressed. And then I tried to kind of pinpoint what was impressive or what was new. And I did a bit of reading. And I think what is new is number one, that's kind of like fully implanted. Like
Yes.
you don't have like
There's
you look at the
nothing
monkey
breaking the skin at all.
precisely.
Yes.
It's just all under there.
Yeah.
Secondly, well, because of that, it's wireless and it's just
Right.
so yeah, it's just from the outside, nothing is different about the monkey, but actually, it's doing this really cool thing.
Right. Right. And I think that the part of that actually is like the ability to wirelessly record and real time use that to sort of decode that information to change something on the screen. The wireless part is actually really a great advance on the experimental side. I don't know how much experience you guys have with working on the primate side, but it's very rare that you actually have them sort of like unrestrained doing like adopting naturalistic postures and executing naturalistic type behaviors. I mean, we could debate the extent to which a monkey sitting and sipping a banana smoothie while using a joystick to play Pong or something else is considered a naturalistic behavior. But it's very rare that you actually have them sort of unrestrained, sitting how they want, doing, just manipulating their hands and stuff.
It definitely opens up the door. Like I had this
Hugely.
chat with actually Alessandra like a while ago, maybe a year ago, but Alessandra is a lab manager where we work, and she has kind of some experience working kind of with monkeys and way more naturalistic settings and kind of nature reserves and kind of studying them from that aspect. And one of the things we chatted about was like, well, we have to do these kind of things where we have a monkey stare at a screen because you can't record in the jungle. But now it doesn't seem so ridiculous.
Yeah.
Like with this kind of advance, and that's kind of mind blowing.
Yeah. There actually is I feel like we've talked about this before offline, but Chris, I don't know if we've talked about this. There's this example in the field of bats. So there's this.
Okay, no, I don't think
this is very cool. There's this researcher, I think at the Weizmann Institute, Nachum Ulanovsky is his name. Basically, he looks at he looks to understand the representation of place and of space in bats, different kinds of bats. And one of the things with bats that differs from the standard experimental settings that people have looked at this type of question is that, people have typically studied this in rodents, in either mice or in rats, whose experience of the world is and of navigating within it is effectively two-dimensional, right? So these animals, basically, they can just crawl around, and they have the ability to do that on planes, and like they can climb hills and stuff, but it's not like they're able to, fly around in the air at all. They don't need to have any representation of the Z per se. So it becomes a really interesting question to understand how that three-dimensional aspect of space is represented in the brain. People identifying grid cells and place cells and that kind of thing. How does that translate to the setting where the animal is not just sort of moving forward and backward and to the sides, but also up and down? And so the bat became a really attractive system for studying this, not only because they sort of fly around instead of just walking, but they also in the wild execute these like massively impressive navigation behaviors where they'll be flying around. They'll fly many kilometers to identify a particular fruit tree which has fruit that they like, and then they'll fly elsewhere, potentially tens of kilometers away, and then the next night they'll return to the exact same tree, right? And these things, they don't have GPS. They're not following any directions. It becomes unbelievably interesting to understand how exactly it is that they're doing that type of thing. So clearly they have some really rich spatial representation.
Like really deep. They're keeping like a really detailed map.
Yes.
In their mind.
And so, but one of the problems is that, you need to be able to, in order to understand how space is being represented, grid cells, place cells, whatever, you need to be able to record neural activity. But how do you do that in an animal that flies? Right? Like you could do that in, say, rats or mice when they're walking around. They're never, you could just have a wired thing even that attaches to them, and they'll still be able to walk around and it's no problem. But when a bat is flying, like the wired thing is basically just going to be a massive tether, right? So that's going to be a big issue. The other thing that's an issue is that the issue of like spatial scale and resolution is known to be super important for studying these issues of like how space is represented, right? So like when people are looking at representations in the entorhinal cortex before the study of grid cells, they had always done it in these enclosures with rats that were really quite small. And one of the key insights of that, some of that initial work was, well, what happens when you make the representation quite a bit larger, like several meters by several meters? And it turns out you see these beautiful grid cell firing properties, right? So we know that sort of ethologically, in the actual behavioral niche of the animal, for the bat, they have to navigate over sort of many kilometers in space, right? So maybe a typical experimental enclosure is going to be the wrong setting for studying them in terms of understanding how space is represented. So, this relates back to the Neuralink thing, which we had started from, in the following way, right? You need some way of wirelessly recording from neurons in the animal's brain while it performs something that it usually performs. And you need to be able to do that in such a way that it won't perturb the animal's ability to actually fly, right? So bats are quite light. Recording apparatus, usually we have you don't design it to be light because it's never moving anywhere. And so basically this group in Israel, they came up with this long tunnel. They built this tunnel with food at the end and different sort of like spatial cues distributed throughout on the order of a kilometer in length. And they came up with this technology for recording wirelessly from neurons in different areas of the bat's brain, and also with a system for tracking and triangulating its location down to millimeter precision for the duration of its flight along the tunnel. And so, it massively facilitated the type of question about how three-dimensional space is represented in organisms for which it's really relevant, in a setting that you would never have been able to do if you were dealing with an animal that was tethered in some way, or where you couldn't record wirelessly and track its behavior wirelessly. And so it opens the type of question that's accessible just massively. And that was true for the bat, and I suspect that it would be true for the primate system as well, in ways that we don't even totally appreciate yet, at least on the systems neuro side, because we're at least to some extent all products of the type of research that has come before, which has always been, it was historically anesthetized animals, now it's in awake behaving animals, but awake behaving but tethered animals, or restrained animals.
Yeah.
And so the next step is the unrestrained, sort of just letting them behave, which I find endlessly exciting.
Well, first of all, this lab in Israel sounds super well funded.
They're
extremely
badass.
Dig just kilometers of tunnel for bats to fly around it.
Yeah.
Second of all, so I guess are you saying that with regards to Neuralink's achievement, that the most impressive side of it is the engineering side rather than the scientific side in decoding the information in the brain, basically?
I haven't thought as much about the scientific side. I think the engineering side is extremely impressive.
Right.
I would probably need to do a little more reading before I make a call as to whether one is more impressive than the other. From an engineering standpoint, I mean, like, the resources that are available at Neuralink are not the standard resources that you would have in an academic research setting. So I think that positions them to do some things that are just massively transcend what most institutions and investigators are able to do. For me, it's also kind of hard to decouple the engineering advance from the scientific advance, because they can do things that people aren't doing because they have techniques that people don't yet have.
Matt, do you know the Cording lab, right?
Yeah.
Conrad Cording. So I was looking at his Twitter the other day, and he was saying like how I don't know. He's kind of being a grouch. He's saying like, how why are people impressed by this Neuralink thing? We've been doing this for like 20 years, but I don't know. That's again not an expert. I need to do more reading, but I think the wireless aspect and the fact that it's like fully implanted,
Yeah.
that part is special, right? Like the decoding might not be special. Like
Right.
people might have been working in this for labs indeed for 10, 20 years, but
Yeah.
the fact that it's so well convenient for the monkey in a way, it's kind of,
And not just
and
for the
it's,
monkey,
yeah.
I think for the investigator too, right? Because all the things
Right.
that, as soon as you have like, broken skin around the head, like there are lots of things that you have to do to like maintain the health of the animal, maintain the health of the implant. Recording and decoding over long time scales has historically been very tough. So people have done the decoding type thing, but it's well known that the longer that you have, say, an array of electrodes implanted for, the lower the yield. So the lower the number of neurons that you're actually capturing from the electrodes that are sort of making up that array, and the worse the decoding quality as time proceeds. So, even I guess numbers wise, they have I think it was on the order of like 2,000 neurons recorded simultaneously or something crazy. So that's a huge number. I don't know how long it's been in there for, but if they can show stability that seems to exceed that of the normal setup, that's also a big advantage. So, elements of it definitely have been done before, but, I don't think that they've necessarily been done this well.
Yeah. Like, I don't know, say what you want about Elon Musk, but his ability to like have a vision and then organize the best people in the world around that vision.
Yes.
And like support them to be productive. Obviously he's not Elon that's like,
right.
Or at least on like, engineering on like a, he's not typing out the code or whatever for the decoder, but kind of, he has a vision, and organizing these obviously very talented people around that vision is kind of amazing.
Right.
And supporting them to achieve those things.
Right. And I think also the part of it is like once you have some set of successful ventures already up and running, then you can use the expertise from those as well as the physical resources from those to massively amplify the success of the other ventures that you attempt. And I think in this case, it's been quite helpful.
Yeah, it's very exciting stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. And if indeed it is the case that, it's all that they've done is literally just a fancier version of what people have been doing in labs before, then maybe neuroscience is a branding problem, right?
We need a better marketing department.
Right. SFN needs to cook something crazy up to amplify the coolness of what we do. And in many cases, if you were to explain this using a PR type, even the stuff that we do or other neuroscience labs do, say like, oh, we use lasers to like manipulate cells activity in the brain to change the animal's behavior. Like that sounds awesome, but often it's lost in like technical language, right? That most people are not gonna necessarily get all that much out of, and it's never being packaged really as a press release, right? So we're not releasing videos that show our animals doing something extremely cool and that anyone can relate to. Like we do tasks that are kind of like specialized for studying a particular thing. Like there's good scientific justification for that, but it doesn't have the same visceral appeal as watching a monkey slurp down banana smoothie while it plays Pong with its mind, right?
What a time to be alive.
Truly.
Yeah, it seems like there seems to be like a new movement towards a sort of like privatized science, where you sort of place a greater emphasis on the commercialization of the implications of the research that you're doing, so as to like make stuff like raising funding a lot easier.
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking about how Neuralink just has so much more resource and hence is able to, achieve like these remarkable engineering feats. I guess there's pros and cons to that. And I can see why like traditional scientists might be a bit salty that, all these things like this Neuralink stuff is getting so much attention. Perhaps because they've done it in a more scientific setting before. But at the same time, like if it works to get the funding and all of that, like why not? I guess maybe one con to it is that all this research and work is being done in service of, potentially selling something someday,
Right.
like, implanting chips in people's brains for some amount of money, rather than to publish paper, which is going to be openly available to everyone.
Right. Yeah, it's a tough question. I feel like I was chatting about this with a friend of mine recently, not exactly that question in terms of the thing, like, science moving toward a more industrial sort of product focused setting, but specifically as it related to like industrial research done through the organization of something like a Bell Labs, as opposed to through large tech companies like a Google or a Facebook or a Microsoft. And one of the points that we came across, which is actually I thought was really interesting. So one of the professors that we'd had, he's a friend of mine from undergrad. One of the professors that we had been at Bell Labs for a long time back in the day. Someone had asked him a similar question in an interview, sort of like, how is Bell Labs different from or similar to the Google research setting or Facebook AI research setting? And the point that he made was similar in a lot of ways, in the sense that you have almost an unprecedented assembly of really talented people focusing on really hard and probably very important problems. Primary difference, and this is, I think, a profound one, is the time frame of the translation or the relevance of those insights to profit for shareholders. So Bell Labs was unique in the sense that they effectively had a monopoly over the communications industry in the U.S. at the time, and so they view this as sort of like the laboratory setting was like a way of doing research that would help to improve the communications infrastructure. But because they had a monopoly, there wasn't such a great pressure to innovate on that side per se anyway. And so it was also an opportunity to, on a time scale of decades, to come up with insights that would lead to technologies for the future, right? And not just necessarily at Bell Labs, but also to be implemented by others. And so the decades-long sort of time frame of relevance was really core to the type of question that people felt that they could address and the type of research that they hired people to do. In contrast, the ecosystem at the moment, say through Google or Facebook or Microsoft, is that even if it does not explicitly shift the type of research that these companies are doing, the company's profit motive is on the time scale of quarter to quarter. And so all of the aspects of what's happening within the company from the high level have to relate in some sense to that quarter by quarter. Are we earning value for our shareholders? Are we positioning ourselves to in the future earn value for our shareholders?
You look at a lab like DeepMind, and they actually do quite long time scale research. I mean,
Yes.
they have a freaking neuroscience department.
Yes, and I think there are notable exceptions to this, and I think
Right.
DeepMind is one of them. And they actually also, I don't know if they still lose a lot of money, but there was I think a long time period where they were not net positive in terms of profit for Google as a whole, right? And like a lot of the stuff they did was very expensive, but it wasn't like they were like a cash cow for Google, right? But like clearly there is value to maintaining an artificial intelligence laboratory that was generating academic insights in the way that they were doing. And then they started seeing a lot of successes in terms of AlphaGo and AlphaZero and that type of stuff, and AlphaFold, I guess, recently. And so I think like as a broad thing, they're like philosophically, there's probably some element of truth to that. In terms of specific examples, you could almost always find for each one of these companies some unit or some aspect of what they're doing, which is very explicitly on the time scale of tens of years. I think DeepMind is actually a great example of one of those things where it's like they're looking at problems that are like massive and not focused on insights for now. The AlphaFold challenge. So this is the trying to predict protein structure from the sequence of amino acids that make it up, right? This was like it's a fundamental problem for basically all domains of biology. Like the structure of a protein tells you a lot about how it interacts with different types of molecules that are in either the intracellular or the extracellular environment. And there's like lots of reasons why it's a really important thing to know. And basically people had thought decades ago that this would be like, we'll handle this problem and then we'll get on to the real work. And it turns out that problem was unbelievably complicated, right? And so like that's one type of example of DeepMind, because they have all these resources and really incredible people, they can tackle a problem that's like a decade-long problem. But I think that's the part that's to be admired and amplified. But there are lots of aspects, I think, of the other sort of subsidiaries of Google research or Microsoft research or whatever, where it certainly differs from the Bell Lab setting in that sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the case with DeepMind as well, it might just like be a scale thing. So a lot of sort of industrialized research, you're saying, probably does live quarter to quarter, but just for the fact that DeepMind's under Google,
right?
Like,
right?
Yeah, they have the benefit of not being constrained, like not being worried that they won't have enough money to do things, like to do cool work or long term work.
Right. Yeah, if you think of it, it's kind of crazy because it's like they have so many researchers that if they were in academia, they will kind of be like star junior faculty or something,
right,
at really prestigious universities, but they're all just all in the same place. And there's real value in that, and I feel like
absolutely
it should be done more.
Yes,
and maybe there's things to think about then the sacrifice to say academic institutions where you then have less, people say choosing to become professors. But if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Like if you're, say one of these top class researchers and you're given the option to be an assistant professor, number one, you'd probably be paid a little bit less as an assistant professor. And number two, even say at the biggest, most prestigious universities like MIT, there's only so many spots for faculty, meaning there's only so many colleagues at the very top level that you can kind of talk to. I guess at MIT maybe it's a lot better because you have Harvard, you have Boston University, all these other universities around it. But kind of the fact, like the density of them being all together and kind of being in in a nice city like London, I think that's in academia you don't always have the choice of where to live, right? And so if someone went along, it's like, oh, you can work with all the best people in your field, live in this great city,
right?
It'll probably be really hard to turn down.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing is like the point that you mentioned with like the two routes are basically like, becoming an assistant professor and running your own research group, or working in this place with this high concentration of people who are all working together. At least in the current academic model, right? Like research groups are kind of like they get funding alone, and they have to, to some extent, serve, like your career is based on the things that you do, the work that you are primarily responsible for in running your research group, which in many cases, because of problems of like credit attribution and stuff, rules out the possibility of sinking all of your time into working together with a bunch of other people on really big problems.
Right. You join a lab like DeepMind and funding isn't really a problem anymore.
Right.
You can focus on science.
Right. Funding is not a problem. Like career advancement is not really a problem. Like everyone is, at least this is how I understand things to be. You see papers and they have like a bunch of really phenomenal people on them. Right. Like it's not like
they share credit really well, it seems.
And it's not necessarily one, really senior PI and then a bunch of like grad students.
It's like the all-star team.
Right. Exactly.
Or it's like Kevin Durant, James Harden,
Yeah. And so I think that's a great point. Like the type of things that you can do when you have, say, 10 people who are all like at that level of like, like intellectual horsepower and like experience in the field and technical ability and sort of like all collaborating to tackle problems together is very different from the setting where you're kind of going it alone, and you're responsible for securing all your funding and all of that kind of thing.
For sure.
And to be clear, that also takes a lot of time. Like the process of getting funding is like, that's time that like you're thinking about what type of experiment you're going to do. But like, even just like the like writing of grants and thinking about grants, all that type of stuff, it's a lot of time that you're spending doing that, and not, explicitly on thinking of ideas for research and doing research and that kind of, and they're not unrelated, but I think it's not an insignificant time sap on the academics list of things to do.
There's definitely positives to like the DeepMind model, and you just hope that maybe then the con is that you have less people in universities and kind of like mentorship roles, but you'd hope that there's some way to bridge those two things.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's a super interesting question to ask. And so would you say, Matt, that you think it's more ideal than if research moves more towards non-academic institutions?
I don't know. I think there are benefits to both models. Yeah, I feel like the ideal thing would be to have some ecosystem where the problems that are associated with either type, whether in the traditional academic institution or in the industrial setting, are just eliminated, and both of their positive attributes can just continue. And that's kind of a fantasy, right? Like I don't know that there's going to be a good solution coming for the problem of how to fund academic research labs, aside from the current model. We also haven't laid out that many drawbacks of the DeepMind style thing, but I guess that only works really if you're dealing with sort of like a company with almost unlimited resources, where like you can afford to, whatever it takes to get really talented people, you get like you'll do it, right? Whatever it takes for them to do the stuff that they need to solve really big problems, you'll do it. That's not a regime in which most institutions can operate.
Mm-hmm. I think probably the you'll need both, no matter what, because academic institutions, they'll always still fund like blue sky research.
Yes.
Whereas while we've been using DeepMind as an example, I think the problem with non-academic research institutions is that they research whatever, as in they have a lot of funding to research whatever is fashionable at the time. So obviously we live in a time where researching AI is super fashionable. Hence, there's a lot of money in that.
Yeah.
But if all research in the world was done in non-academic institutions, then we'd not be funding the type of blue sky research whose, real world, so to speak, applications are, decades down the line. But it's always good to plant those seeds early.
Yeah.
I think another aspect.
Sorry.
Oh no, go for it.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say another aspect of the academic institutions is like, which I think is not necessarily the same as the role in carrying out research, but is related, is like the training of new researchers, right? And so I don't know that would be a good responsibility to foist onto the non-academic research setting in the same way as it has been carried out in the academic one. Like I think there is value to having an institution where like the primary responsibilities include both the development of new knowledge and also the training of people to develop new knowledge, whether that includes traditional sort of like coursework based academic background stuff, or whether that includes like in-depth mentorship in terms of growing this person's ability to be a scientist.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it seems like there shall be better ways to do it, but
yeah. Big important problems.
Yeah, we've been going on for a while, but before we ended, I did want to kind of switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about maybe thinking on a different scale, maybe on less on kind of broad questions about cognition in general and kind of studies of n=1, kind of personal lives and stuff. So we talked about this a bit before, but you mentioned actually that one of your favorite classes in college was this Russian literature class you talked with your brother. And
yes.
You talked a bit about that, but Yeah, I don't know. I thought it might be fun to talk a little bit about that too, because I guess, you know, was the class in Russian, or were you reading in Russian or English?
No, we were reading in English. So that
Okay.
actually it was a couple of classes. We took I guess two of them together, and then we'd taken a bunch of them separately. But started out with this class called the Great Russian Novel and Beyond. And so I actually had never read any Russian literature before coming to college. But essentially, the way this class was set up is it was a journey from. So there's this really rich Russian novelistic tradition, starting in the late 1700s and continuing all the way until today, basically. But so starting, it was basically a chronological progression through that. So starting from things like Fathers and Children or Fathers and Sons by Turgenev, and then going through some of the real classics from Tolstoy and Dostoyevsky, all the way up until some of the Stalinist era works. And at that point, it wasn't all novels that we were reading, but it was sort of like novels and plays and the type of literature that people were generating as art and as sort of like cultural artifacts of that time. And I mean, it totally changed my life. Just that first glimpse. There was some of the Tolstoy and some of the Dostoevsky stuff. I found that they have this like fixation on these like really massive questions about life and about what it means to be alive and to be a human, and things that are even though in many cases the language is not the language that we use, and the sort of like characters that they create and that through whom they explore these questions and ideas are sort of like at a surface level, not really. They're speaking differently than how we speak, and they interact with different social norms than how we interact. But the things that they're really obsessed with are things that people remain obsessed with today, right? Like questions of like, I guess this is kind of a trite example, but why do bad things happen to good people? Or like a more specific version of that. Children haven't done anything wrong. Why is it that bad things sometimes happen to children? Like how can that be, right? So that's an example that's specifically from the Brothers Karamazov, but it's the type of question that you see throughout basically all of their literature. And so from those initial things, once I had started reading that type of literature, it felt hard to go back to reading other stuff. And so I continued and did a deep dive in a course on Dostoevsky with the same professor, a course on Tolstoy with a different professor, and then finally the course that we talked about was this reading course. There were 4 people in the class. There's I guess the professor and then 4 students. The professor is the same professor who had taught that initial class on the Great Russian Novel. And then there were 2 graduate students in the Slavic department. I think they actually did the reading in Russian. But
Wow.
I don't speak Russian, neither does my brother, so we did not. We got an exemption from that. So it was them 2 and us 2.
Do you remember the name of the professor?
Yes, Ellen Chances. Yeah, we've been in touch a bit since then. She is an incredible person. She graduated from Princeton with her PhD, I think in the either the late 60s or the early 70s, and is actually the first female graduate alumna to join the faculty.
Oh, wow.
So she's been around for quite a long time. But so in the case of the last course, she was actually like sort of close personal friends with the author whose work we were studying. And he died relatively recently, but he was still alive at that point. And they would have these like Skype calls or telephone calls after every time that we met, and they would discuss the things that we discussed, which was a crazy experience. Like I've never had a class on literature where there's any type, especially not something like Russian literature, where there's any type of direct connection to like the author who's generating the stuff. But yeah, it was a wild experience. And I think the fixation on questions, big questions that won't go away, is the the thing that initially drew me in and that continues to keep me around and interested.
Do you feel that like the sort of focus on the big questions is somewhat lacking in American literature?
I think it's still there.
Classic American literature.
I think it's still there. I think the Russians did it really well.
Or do you have any vivid memories of, say, a particular question that maybe you discussed at length with your brother, like a particularly vivid discussion that, I don't know, that just stands out to you or something like that? Or with the class in general? Yeah, I don't know. Up to you.
It's a good question.
Because it is quite special that you had this with your brother. Like, as in, it's not, I don't know. Yeah.
I think so. One of the things that I definitely do remember is, so in the context of that final class, so my brother is studies biology. He's a grad student studying metabolism. So the makeup of the class was basically two people who were very much in the world of STEM and two people who are very much in the world of the humanities. The discussions that we had as a result were actually quite interesting, sort of like the ways that people have of looking at these, of looking at the same type of work. You're reading exactly the same thing, and then the points that you bring are sort of a function of who's doing the reading, right? And so we would read the same thing and often say totally different stuff. So there was, we don't come from a background of where close reading is the sort of like the key element of the toolbox. I mean, like, you do have to read closely as a scientist, but it's not the same as sort of like close reading of humanistic works, I think. We actually had this project at the end where each of us had to sort of like create something from our own perspective that related to some of the ideas or the works that we discussed in the class. One of the grads, actually, I think that, so the two grad students who were in the class, they each wrote something that was sort of like, either a story that arose out of the work that we'd read and echoing some of the same themes or exploring some of the same questions or things of that nature. I remember things totally switched in the second half of that class. So one of the things that we'd read about was this book called the Teacher of Symmetry, and I don't even know a really good way of explaining it. It was this novel. It's kind of funny to try and explain. So it's sort of like a postmodern type. I don't even know what this mishmash of stuff that this author had come up with. He'd started it maybe like 30 or 40 years before and then put it down and then came back to it much later. But putatively in the introductory materials, in the foreword, he's like, I actually just, someone told me this novel a long time ago, and I'm writing down what I remember of it, but it's not mine. And it's not true, of course. Like, he actually had written the whole thing, but the whole project was revolving around different types of symmetry. So, for example, there was this story at the end where it's sort of like a collection of related stories, all of which are focused in some way or another on some type of symmetry within the life of the characters who are involved. So there's this final story where it's like the narrator is at the end of his life. It's not totally clear, but he finds himself in this room, and there's nothing in the room in terms of features that get you outside, right? There's no windows, there's no door. He has no idea how he got there. There's just this button, which it's not clear what it does. But so he starts looking around this room. He's totally confused as to who he is, why he's there, all that stuff. And then he sees this big pile of objects, right? And there's nothing else there. So he starts sifting through them. And he begins to notice that these are all the things that he ever lost in his life. So say he lost a sweater when he was a child. That sweater is in this pile, right? He lost a textbook when he was in college. He finds his textbook in the pile. And he's extremely confused as to how this could be, because he lost all of these things, in different countries over the course of like an entire life. How is it that they're all here? it's very eerie. So then he turns around to, see what else is in the room, and he sees another pile of objects. And he goes over to look at them, and he sees actually that these were not more things that he lost, but they were actually things that he'd stolen, intentionally or unintentionally. Everything that he'd stolen his entire life, right? So there's this other sort of angle of symmetry, things that he'd lost, things that other people had lost that he'd ended up with, right? So things like that. Anyway, so that's a long digression, but so we arrive at this thing where we have to sort of present something that relates to the things that we'd been thinking about in the context of this class. So my brother stands at the board and he's like, he studied chemistry when he was undergrad. He's like, there's a specific or a set of specific definitions for what it means for something to be symmetrical in chemistry. And he walks through a lesson of chemical symmetry, which is totally different from all the things that we'd heard about. And yet each of the things was related in some way. They're like defining what it means for things to be symmetric or things to be similar. Those are questions that have meaning in terms of molecules, and they also have meaning in terms of, things that are not explicitly molecules. These are more conceptual things that we had read about in the course.
Do you remember any of the definitions or the basics? No.
I can put you in touch with him, but I got nothing. It was great when he said it. I felt like I understood it when he was explaining it, but it's been a few years since then.
That's an interesting story. And
yeah, that whole book is actually a crazy book. There's this one of the other stories in that collection, in the Teacher of Symmetry. It was this story about, I don't remember how this relates to symmetry actually, but it was this story about this man who claims that he has descended from the moon. And he says he's absolutely adamant that he's not from Earth. And it's in the 1800s, I think, in Germany or something. There's not exact about setting, but essentially no one believes him. And so he's thought of as being the town idiot, right? No one, he's just fixated on this thing, I came from the moon, right? And so there's this psychoanalyst in the school of Freud, I think, who lives in the town. And he's like, aha, this is my chance to analyze someone who doesn't have it all together. This is psychologically very interesting. Let me examine him. And so he has this set of sessions with this guy. He's a very sweet character. He's extremely innocent and kind and all that. The person who claims to have come from the moon. So he has this series of investigations where he's trying to characterize all these different sort of shortcomings of the patient mentally, right? And eventually in one of their discussions, they get to this thing of maybe coming up with some proof that he came from the moon. Eventually the character who claims that he came from the moon, I don't want to ruin the story, but I believe that he dies. But he dies and he brings proof that he had come from the moon. It's there's this handlebars of something that was not from Earth, a couple hundred yards or something from where he landed. But yeah, it's a very weird book.
Well, what's this book called? It sounds so symbolic, so densely symbolic.
It's called The Teacher of Symmetry.
Teacher of Symmetry by
Andrei Bitov.
Yeah. Was this the author you talked to, or was this a different author?
We didn't talk to him directly, but
okay.
the professor and this guy were close friends.
The author of The Teacher of Symmetry.
Yes. Yeah.
Wow,
his thing that he became really famous for was this novel called Pushkin House. So it's kind of the novel that made people think he's the modern heir to the tradition of Tolstoy and Dostoyevsky in terms of the great Russian novel. But so this was written in the after, he grew up in the time of Stalin. So this was written in the aftermath of a lot of that stuff. And it's sort of organized. It's very self-referential to all the rest of Russian literature. So all the characters have names that are symbolic of other figures in Russian literature. So the main character's name is Lev Nikolaevich, which is Tolstoy's name. And so there's all kinds of resonance with and like very carefully and precisely constructed resonance with basically every other aspect of Russian literature. Like these are all things that Russian children basically were forced to read or had to read as part of every school curriculum. But the different chapters were basically set up focusing on the different ways in which the communist regime had ruined people's lives. So in terms of relationships with parents, that was like the first chapter, in terms of romantic relationships, and in terms of relationships with art and with creativity. Which, if you're going to read any of his stuff, I would recommend that would be the one to grab, because it's really a tour de force.
Yeah, thanks. That sounds quite interesting.
Yeah. A little heavy at times, but
can you say, or why do you think the Russians did the Great Question so well? Or do you have family ties to Russia? No? Or
way back, but not
way
recently.
Back?
Yeah. So
okay.
My grandfather, the only reason I know this is because my grandfather is, he obsessively maintains a family tree. This is like his big thing, is like the genealogy of everything that's related to anyone who's related to us by marriage, by blood, whatever.
Interesting.
So since probably the 90s, he's maintained a digital copy of this family tree. And every time someone joins the family, he basically interviews them and assembles their whole family tree with as much detail as he can. So it has like thousands of people are on this tree. But his so he's from South Africa, but I think his grandfather came from Russia. So that's the closest connection that I have. So
that's not that far back.
Yeah, it's like 3 or 4 generations, I guess. Which I guess is not that far back. Yeah, but that had nothing to do, I think, with the fixation on Russian literature. I think part of it was also the professor was, I mean, there were multiple professors involved, but that particular professor, she was extremely charismatic, and she had an incredible way of explaining things where the question itself was highlighted and never really got lost in details. And the details that were presented in a way that really emphasized like the main point. And so it became quite clear that like the text was exemplifying this particular thing or emphasizing this particular point. And I think in a way that is often lost in terms of how that type of analogy or simile or whatever is explained. She did a phenomenal job.
Like it was more like you're in dialogue with the novel or with the on this particular question rather than like fixating on that particular novel or something.
And I think the other thing was, so she would do this thing where she would like put the novel in context first historically in terms of like what were the events that were happening at the time. In many cases, that relates to the key ideological points. So like there was this, for example, for some of the early stuff from Dostoyevsky, there's like this massive debate between rationalists and irrationalists. So these people who believe that everything could just be attributed to some form of reason, or everything is a result of reason. And that's the key factor that governs human behavior as well as the progression of the world. And then, there's obviously the counterpoint, which is that's actually not at all what matters. You've got it totally wrong. Everything is irrational. And then obviously there are people in between. But so first, highlighting the debates that people sort of external to the novel were having, which I think really nicely put in context sort of like the particular positions that the author was taking through different characters or through different points of elements of the plot. And then I think the other thing, in terms of the relationship with close reading, she would do this thing where she would, instead of providing honing in on just one paragraph and really attributing great significance to individual details within that paragraph, she would do close reading, but distribute it. So she would make a point and then she would say specific examples of this point. And then she would go through and do close reading on like 10 different paragraphs. And, one of the things that I always found tough is like, well, like, anything in isolation, you could sort of ascribe any interpretation that you want and have at least some reasonable amount of support for it. But the pattern becomes very compelling when it's like, repeatedly, 10 different times, specific examples, very much the same thing happening or very similar things happening, makes it feel like it's something really real and something to dig into. I think in many cases revealed aspects of meaning from the author and their social context and what they were trying to bake in that I would not have gotten otherwise. So maybe it wasn't that the Russians did it better. Maybe it's just that I had someone walk me through it.
You had a great professor.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think that's often
Oftentimes
the thing.
Yeah.
Not just for professors, but also just like in life. It's like, why do you like to do this thing? It's like, well, I had this person who was really fun to do things with, and they like to do this thing.
Right.
And they were good at it. It's like, oh, yeah. Interesting.
But yeah, strong recommend. Russian literature of all kinds.
Yeah, I was just looking at it. I might try to get it on Amazon, the Symmetry teacher.
Yeah. Don't be surprised if it's hard to read at first. There are some stories that I think are easier than others, or some chapters that are easier than others.
Right. Yeah. So we were initially going to, I guess, have this conversation like a week ago or 2 weeks ago, but I guess that was kind of during Passover. And I guess one of the interesting things is that you seem kind of quite close to your family, and one of the central things that you do with your family is kind of these kind of traditions and kind of Jewish traditions.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I'm quite curious, like what the importance of that in your life is, and kind of what can you describe to someone who's kind of an outsider, like, obviously it probably isn't like a singular Jewish culture, but what is that to you? And for example, what is Jewish culture or values to you particularly, maybe?
Yeah, sure. So I guess a little bit of personal background. So, so my dad's side of the family was Jewish. My mom converted when she met my dad. So her side of the family is not Jewish. But so growing up, it was, we until like kindergarten, for like preschool and like early childhood education, we didn't do Jewish schooling. And then when I started first grade, from that point on, it was a Jewish school the rest of the way. So from the family side, I think very important is really you kind of picked up on this, a very central part of, we would get together for all of the holidays. I think part of the thing was that, the family were very close, geographically and also in terms of kinship. So, like my aunt and uncle and grandparents lived like 40 minutes away when I was a child. So they lived in DC and I'm from Baltimore. And then they moved to Baltimore when I was maybe 12 or 13. So to like half a mile away. So like they've always been close enough where we could celebrate all of these things together. So I think that was a big element in terms of like, it's not so easy to separate sort of like the Jewish ritual part from the family connection part. I think personally, so I don't know totally where I stand theologically, but interestingly enough, there's actually not a strict requirement on theology even in traditional Jewish practice. So there's this idea that so there's this whole set of Jewish law known as halacha, which is sort of like nitty gritty, nuts and bolts rules that should govern how you behave in everyday life. So the laws of kashrut govern the things that you can eat. There are laws that govern what types of things you can do on different types of festival or different types of holiday. Laws that govern like business practice and interpersonal relationships, things like that. So the philosophy essentially that is adopted even within the framework of people who take sort of like who follow all of those laws to the letter, is that there is a benefit even if you don't believe, you don't accept sort of like the premise that like the worth of doing these practices derives from there being some God who created the universe and commanded that these things be done. There's still benefit even apart from that in actually doing them, and there's no requirement at any point for a belief in the execution of the practice, which I find to be kind of interesting. And obviously, I don't follow to the letter of the law on everything, but I think that there probably is actually, in terms of the way that it fosters community and things like that, I think there is a lot of benefit. So for me, that's probably at the moment the big the role that it plays, or the hole that it occupies in my life, is as a sort of cultural / community bonding element, where just by virtue of the fact that you're also doing these things that other people are doing, regardless of what you believe about the importance for doing them, that you share actually quite a lot and quite profoundly just by virtue of sharing that. And I think
kind of these shared. Sorry.
No, go for it.
Or so is it kind of these kind of shared principles for how to live, or kind of
even at a more basic level, a shared principle for like not even in terms of values, just like in terms of some elements of practice, shared. I don't even want to say it's like elements of how to live or principles of how to live, so much as like shared principles of like what to do, kind of. So it's like
what do you mean?
almost more on the ritual side than it is on the value side. I think the value part I also think plays a role in how I live, but I think that's almost a separate thing. And that's more, I think, as a function of like like having received a primary school education that was basically split curriculum, half of it Jewish studies, half of it secular studies. I think a lot of that stuff was quite formative for the values that I practice or believe in today. And those include things like, I guess at a very high level. So there are some like specific values that one could pick upon. Things like there's this principle called like pikuach nefesh, which is like more important than anything else. You have to like save a life if there's the chance to do it. So there's specific examples like that. And I think there's also general principles, which is sort of like, there are some things that almost override any other value that you have. One of them being the preservation of life and of its sanctity. Like, I think that's, one of the things that, one of the sort of high level values that I would say I pull from the Jewish heritage or Jewish tradition.
Another sort of question that I want to ask about this is there are some religions, I guess, where there are certain beliefs that you must hold, where if you're sort of like a scientific researcher, it creates certain contradictions.
Yeah.
Would you say it's less so or different with the Jewish heritage that you have?
I think it depends on your particular Jewish heritage. I think in my case, the answer is that it actually kind of promotes the being in the scientific realm or thinking scientifically or wanting to become a scientist. Because I think, so like, at least the way that I interpret it is sort of like there's this view that like, if you accept the premise, and I'm not saying whether I do or I don't, but if you accept the premise that like there is some sort of like purpose for the universe existing, like maybe it was created by something or some being, right? That everything that's in the universe was thus created by that being, right? And so there's sort of one creation, which is the actual creation of those things. And then there's a separate creation, which is sort of personal, which is the creation of that thing or knowledge about that thing for you. And that feels kind of like science, right? Which is like coming to understand all of the things that are in the world, how they work, what they are, how they relate to one another. And so it feels like that's maybe not such, like there is some justification for doing that kind of thing, right? Like if you take the world to be, created by a god, and just by virtue of things having been created by that god, that they're, good and worthy, or whatever metric you want to apply to them, they're good, then it feels like it's a good thing also by extension to understand all of those things, or to try to understand them. I think the point where they're definitely, so if you ascribe to the traditional theology, there are issues in terms of belief about the creation of the world. Like, I'm sure that for many people that's an issue. I don't the amount that I believe stops far short of there. And so I think for me, it's no issue at all. I think it's probably, if you were to take, if you were to look at the, far extreme in terms of orthodoxy within Judaism, it's probably very similar to what you see for any other religion that has a very traditional view about, the origin of the world. I think a lot of it relates to the story of cosmogony, like how the world came to be, right? And that often that account diverges from, in meaningful ways, I think, from what science suggests. But I don't think I'm all the way at that side, and so for me, it's no issue.
That's really fascinating to know. And would you say, other people of similar Jewish heritage who share this same sort of line of thinking, that it doesn't really sort of contradict a scientific path, but rather even encourage it?
I think there probably is there's probably a large group of people who would hold a similar view. I think there's also different ways of rationalizing it. So my particular thing is, well, I'm going to interpret the Jewish side, to be actually encouraging of, the scientific endeavor. When I was in high school, I took a biology class, which was co-taught by two people, both great teachers. One of them, a really, really, really religious Jewish person. And the strategy that we adopted in the class was, someone actually asked at some point, this is the question that we're all thinking of, but creation of the world, what's the deal here? And she's like, this is a conversation that maybe we can get into after you've graduated. I want to avoid it like the plague for this entire course. And so we never mentioned it. But I don't know what her answer would have been.
Oh, you didn't ask her at the end.
I never followed up.
I guess it's never too late.
I think nowadays sometimes people are afraid of saying things that are not totally in line with quote unquote accepted truth.
Yeah.
It's kind of a shame, because the world's pretty messy. It's pretty hard to make sense of. No one really knows everything that's going on.
Right.
And
totally. So,
I wonder why she felt that way.
Yeah, I think part of it was I could understand not wanting to spend valuable class time on
sure,
things related to personal beliefs. So it may have been something related to that. The other extenuating factor was that we had this is my senior year. So we had a very abbreviated senior year in terms of instruction time. And technically it was an AP class. So there was instruction toward the AP exam, where there's a particular amount of material that you have to fit into what in our case was a very abbreviated amount of time. But I don't know how much that had to do with it, as opposed to just saying, I know that people are going to disagree with me, so maybe I don't want to.
Right.
Which I can also understand. I wouldn't necessarily want to be up in front of a class justifying my views in front of people who I know are not likely to agree with them.
Yeah. So in terms of, I guess, the community feeling that you're describing, so is it more in terms of kind of just kind of this shared experience?
I think for me at the moment, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I think especially like pandemic time, like just that like shared experience aspect, like I feel like I'm really acutely missing. So maybe I'm honing in on that more than I would if you'd asked me this question, say 2 years ago,
Right.
or a year and a half ago, I guess. But I think it's probably a problem that a lot of people have been feeling, because many of the ritual observances are done, are meant to be done together. Like there's a sort of like a minimum limit on number of people that you can have before you do prayers of a particular kind that are like required.
Interesting.
Yeah. So there's like a necessary quorum that you have to meet in order to do particular ritual acts. So like, how do you do that in the time where you like literally can't meet up with people in person with the number of folks that's past X, which I think is not an easy.
What's the number?
10.
Huh.
Yeah, which is there's you could, so in Israel there was, when they had capacity limits on events, because of the size of the ultra Orthodox population, there was a reason why they made the limit 10 or fewer was being allowed. And it was specifically to allow that type of ritual observance.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So religion and policy mixing in interesting ways. I actually may have to go in just a few minutes.
Yeah, that's perfect. We've been going on for a while. And
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, that was kind of a nice talk to end on. Just a little bit about thinking, I guess, on a more personalized level.
Yeah.
Sometimes a lot of things get lost in thinking about, state spaces and dynamical systems and so forth. But
turns out there are other things to think about.
Yeah. So I guess Matt, thanks so much for joining us. That was a lot of fun.
Thanks for having me.
That was super enjoyable. Yeah, hope you have fun as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I felt like we could. Sorry, go on.
No, I was just gonna say, not all of my answers or explanations I think were as cogent as I would have liked, but hopefully something interesting.
Oh, not all. I think you like sort of articulated everything really clearly and systematically. I think
it's tough to know like what angle to approach things from based on like background of the other people in the conversation, as well as like who may be listening at some point.
Right.
So
I think me and Reza are still trying to figure this out as well.
I think it's
like it'll be interesting to find out who does end up listening to these.
I think it's an interesting question. It's a critical one for the growth of the pod.
Yeah, I mean, we could have kept talking for hours, and I guess we'll definitely have you back on. Hopefully,
I would love to be back. Hopefully they'll have some answers by the time they come back about some of the things that we discussed.
That'll be amazing.
Whether it's not, even if it's not me, as long as someone has answers, I would feel good about that.
Yeah. All right.
Cool.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
This
All right.
is great. Again. Thanks for having me, guys.